All right. My name is Rich Schmidt. We're here with Ben Eyer and Stephane Bojarski. It's November 3rd, 2025, with the Nicholson Library at Linfield University in McMinnville. And Stephane, Ben, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us.
The first question, either of you can take this and run with it, is why wine?
So this is probably more for me, since I drug her into this more than anything else. I think my journey to wine probably began in some form with my paternal grandfather. He made a small amount of cellar wine in 5-gallon fermenters in the basement. He had some French hybrids in Pennsylvania, where I grew up. And that was probably my first interaction with wine around a family table, I would say. And then kind of that interest slowly grew as I went through college and graduate school and tasted more and different wines from all across the country, probably mostly California, since that's what was available in the Pennsylvania state store for sale. There's not, now there's probably bigger, but even still, it's mostly a California dominated store, I would say, and then Italians as well. So that's kind of what was on offer when I was in graduate school, which is where we met in Pittsburgh. So that would be kind of the very beginnings of the journey, I would say. And then while I was at the University of Pittsburgh going through my Ph.D., I kind of decided I didn't want to finish it. I had done some internships in undergrad and seen kind of the pharmaceutical pathway for a Ph.D. in organic chemistry. So I decided to leave with my master's. I was working on the UC Davis winemaking certificate at the same time. And then that's when I started harvest hopping.
What were your impressions of wine, Stephane?
Well, I went to college, so came in a bag. I met Ben, and he was an organic chemistry PhD student, and then all of a sudden he's like, will you marry me? And now I'm going to go make wine. Can you plan the wedding? Thanks. I was like, I guess so. I was an engineering PhD student at Carnegie Mellon, so neighboring university, and eventually he's increased my taste threshold from bags, $2 check, to now really awesome Pinot Noirs from the Willamette Valley and everything like that. So yeah, it's grown with our relationship, I'd say. I still do engineering. I'm not in the wine industry, except for whenever I am. So I'm on leave right now from my job because we just had a baby, and we started this wine brand and needed to figure out distribution and finances and bookkeeping and labels and marketing, all this stuff that the winemakers don't necessarily want to do, but they say that they do. I'm like, oh, that sounds great. That just sounds like a system that I can work it through and make sure this business is actually functioning. So that's how I found myself in the wine industry. Was we're investing in this. This is Ben's dream. Let's make it happen and make it happen the right way.
I think one of our distribution partners, when you were talking to them, you said, I'm not in the wine industry. They're like, if you're talking to me, you are.
If you want to sell your wine in all of the different states, I think you might be. But it's very strictly like nights and weekends otherwise. And otherwise, he just feeds me wine. It's just good wine now. Rarely any bags.
Well, before we pick up your wine story, let's talk about life before wine a little bit. Stephane, let's talk with you.
Sure.
Tell us about where you're born and raised and kind of your path into college.
So I was born in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, raised in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Went to high school there as well, and then needed to get a little bit further away for college and went to Lehigh University, which was like the other side of Pennsylvania, closer to Philadelphia. I studied material science and engineering and did rowing. I think those were sort of my two different lives in college. Graduated in 2010, so right after no one was getting hired. They were just easing back into, a solid workforce. I ended up going to grad school. I got my Ph.D. in material science and engineering at Carnegie Mellon. So I went back to Pittsburgh more because of the opportunity, less to go back home. And when I was there, I did meet Ben. So that's sort of the pre-Ben story.
what was your, as you were in undergrad and then graduate school, what was your plan for the future? What were you planning to do with your degree?
I didn't have very strong plans. I think even if you talk to my advisor, he still tells people about me because I was all over the place. I worked my first internship in logistics. My second internship was in a steel mill. That was very dirty.
Very Pittsburgh.
Yeah, very Pittsburgh. I was like, I got to just do it because the Steelers and everything. It was very dirty. After that, I decided, I need a cleaner environment, so I worked in the Stanford Nanotechnology clean room, which is much cleaner. I was like, nanotechnology seems like a great thing to do. And then I jumped over to ceramics research for my Ph.D. In between undergrad and grad school, I did some organic light emitting diode and organic photovoltaic research in a startup company in Pittsburgh, just to fill in. H&M wouldn't hire me, so I got a technical internship instead. And then I got my PhD in ceramics. That was slow, and I decided to jump over to Intel, which is a really fast-paced environment, and I've been doing process integration there ever since. So building the devices that they sell, primarily doing research on that, and then I just recently jumped over to foundry interfacing, more customer role.
That's quite a path.
Yeah, I just jump all over the place, and occasionally I'm like, okay, well, I'm comfortable enough here, I guess I'll go do wine, On the most broad spectrum PhD you'll find, I think.
Love that.
Yeah.
All right, Ben, same question for you. Tell us about life before wine, where you're born and raised and path into college.
So I grew up in Manheim, Pennsylvania, which is in Lancaster County, so the opposite end of the state, closer to Lehigh than obviously Pittsburgh is. So I had kind of the same thing. I crossed the state because I wanted to move farther away from home to be in college, so I went 5 hours, to the northwest corner to Allegheny College, so small liberal arts college, very similar to Linfield. My two lives in college was I ran collegiately, so I had year-round sport between cross-country, indoor, and outdoor track. That's still kind of a big part of who I am, I would say, as I've gotten older. And with the other half would have been like chemistry. But I kind of, much like Steph, I did kind of experiment with where I was going to go when I entered college. So I had a freshman chemistry course, I really liked it, so that's how I kind of ended up on the chemistry trajectory. But what I was going to do with that was very much in flux, I would say, throughout undergrad. I kind of had myself set up between going to be a pharmacist, so getting a doctor in pharmacy, some level of medical school, as well as graduate school in something at any given point within my undergrad program in chemistry. And then I also did a double major in Spanish, so I spent a semester abroad. Lived in Sevilla, so I had those two kind of things going on in college. So eventually I decided I was going to go to graduate school. The year before my senior year, I did an internship, essentially in my eventual advisors group, Dr. Whip at University of Pittsburgh. So that was my leeway into, I would say, graduate school, was working in Pittsburgh that summer before my senior year, and then eventually applying and going to University of Pittsburgh. And then in graduate school, like we kind of already discussed, I figured out it wasn't the path I necessarily want to be on. I didn't want to be my advisor and write grants all the time. I kind of seen pharmaceutical research at the time. It's a little bit better now, but at the time it was kind of depressing. The companies would get bought out, research would get flushed. You may never make a successful drug. So I was kind of looking for an avenue to use chemistry where there'd be something at the end of the year, at the end of the career, you could say, I made this, I did this, as opposed to just constantly trying to make a successful drug candidate and never having anything that passed the whole way through, up to human trials and eventually being released as a commercial cure or treatment for something. So that's kind of how I ended up in wine. I mean, you would tell it a little bit differently, the story that.
I mean, you did come to me saying I just want to be outside and speak Spanish. There's this part of me that isn't alive right now that I need to go and make alive, and I don't need a PhD for that. And that I think that's the more romanticized message that at least I heard, where I was like, oh, this guy's passionate. That's a good thing, And
I think with the wine industry, maybe the difficulty of what is sometimes asked of winemakers and brands is maybe some of the partial intrigue for me. Not that it necessarily makes it any easier, but you're kind of asked to be, you're an image for a brand. You have to be a leader. You have to be a representative for the brand. You have to be a manager and manage a team of individuals. You have to be good, quantitatively to look at like the actual chemical analysis and understand all the workings that can be going on underneath, the subtleties of like what different changes in numbers might mean from a bigger picture, but also like all the organoleptic, the qualitative, the tasting, the sensory stuff. There's some aspect of like, if you're not managing your own brain, you still have to have some level of business acumen, not maybe as much as like we do necessarily now, being like kind of we are the business at the moment. But there is that dynamic, like constant learning and evolving day to day that kind of creates interest, despite the fact that we are in a very cyclical industry. I mean, like every year, more or less, we do the same thing. Nature changes it subtly, but like it is kind of a rinse and repeat every year and flow. So like that can maybe get mundane after a while, but like, with between the seasonal weather, the changes in the vintages, but also like the dynamic changes in like the business and the other aspects of the job, like there's always something that you're doing or learning or that's evolving that's different, I would say. So that kind of also drew me to wine, as you can kind of touch a little bit of everything.
Did you know that going in though?
No, I didn't know that going in, I would say. To some extent. I mean, you knew there was going to be different aspects of the job. I think,
That's sort of what made you want to start your own thing, right?
Yeah, I think to some extent. There's never a boring day.
Never a boring day.
No.
Exactly.
Something will surprise you.
How did you two meet?
Mutual friends. Yeah, so I had a friend from Lehigh who ended up working at Allegheny in a AmeriCorps teaching position. And then he had a friend who stayed at Allegheny in the same position, and they knew each other, and they're like, oh, we both have nerdy friends that live in Shadyside who like to run, they should run together. So thanks, Laura and Ryan.
Yeah.
So you mentioned earlier that it was kind of as you two were getting together and as you're getting engaged, things were changing. So tell me about that time of leaping into winemaking. What was the first step for you as you thought about getting into the wine industry?
I think in graduate school I started like just searching for ways that I could learn more, some theoretical stuff about like wine specific stuff. I mean, the chemistry stuff I knew, biology, but like I wanted to learn like the practical side of like actually making wine, at least from a theory perspective to start, and then kind of figure out like how do I make that transition. So I think that's how somehow I stumbled on, and maybe at the time it might have been the only one, but the online certificate that Davis had, I don't think Washington State had theirs at that point, but I could be wrong. So I found that, I started doing those courses. So there was essentially like it was a minor worth of courses, 5 classes that you did online. You'd have some interaction with professors, you had assignments you submitted. So that was kind of like, I was like, well, I'll try the first one and see what I think, and if I'm still interested in going down this path, and then just kind of worked my way through. I can't remember exactly. It was either the first 2 or the first 3 I did when I was finishing graduate school, and then the rest was while I was harvest hopping around, the world to start, but then the US. So that was kind of how that all, I think, came to fruition.
And that was the UC Davis Extension program.
Yeah, there was a certificate. They still have it.
So you were finishing grad school and also taking that. Tell me about that.
That was a little intense. I mean, we have kids now. I'd say that was easier. My assignments aren't running away from me and screaming at me when they don't get what they want. So
One PI.
Yeah, we didn't have a pet at the time.
You just had like 14-hour work days, that's all.
Yeah, but I'd be running a lot of experiments in the lab. Some would take longer than others. I'd have reactions that were 15 minutes, and then you work them up and purify them. Then you'd have some that ran for hours. If I didn't have other things to do, I could fit like a reading in. You just kind of made it fit where it worked. And then some of the classes, especially the ones that were very chemistry based, like the first half of the course was like, I did the assignments, they were easy. It was chemistry. It was like stuff that like I had done in undergrad, less so graduate school, because of the level that we were looking at from like the organic chemistry standpoint at that juncture. But yeah, some of the stuff was easy. I would just do the assignments. I went through the reading. It was like it was all the basic chemistry that I had already done. Mm-hmm. Because again, they would lead and build each class for someone that had some level of chemistry background, but it was more like you took that intro chemistry course and then you moved into this, as opposed to like I had a degree. I'd gone through, biochemistry, analytical chemistry, thermodynamics. Like I'd done all of the higher level prerequisite courses. So like some of those were a little easier than others. the viticulture one would have been like the biggest challenge, where I actually did have to pay attention to all the reading. Like, that was like, it is still the area that I know the least about in winemaking. Obviously continuously learning, especially with this brand, and talking with we have growers, we don't have any of our own grapes. So I lean on them for their expertise.
And even when you visit them, you're the one doing the looking at the chemistry, right? Like,
to some extent, yeah. Yeah, we make the picking decisions and work with them, so there's still that chemistry side for sure.
He's underplaying that our whole basement has testers and
yeah. I have analysis equipment for my day job.
A lot of analysis equipment that he runs constantly right before harvest when we're making those decisions. Our son thinks that grape juice just comes in bags now.
So you mentioned harvest hopping as the next step. Tell me about coming out of the UC Davis program. What made you think, what made that the next step for you?
So I guess when I left University of Pittsburgh with my master's, it was a connection from a winemaker that was teaching one of those courses with a professor in Chile who connected me with a winery. So I went down to Viña Santa Carolina in Chile and worked my first harvest.
What year?
2013. So that would have been I finished my defense in February and then pretty much immediately left on an airplane, as she described already. So between March to June is more or less when we were working through harvests from a picking to end of fermentation standpoint. And I stayed on a little bit longer. I had to go renew my tourist visa that I was on by crossing into Argentina and coming back. So I visited a winemaker in Mendoza that owed my bosses a favor. So he drove me around Mendoza and took me a bunch of different places. Dominio de Plata. We went to the Pyramid Winery. Drawing a blank on the name at the moment, but Catena Zapata. So we went there, where they have a bunch of barrels displayed, but it's only a sparkling facility, at least at that time. So yeah, I went to a bunch of different places, visited some smaller facilities. They're friends of friends. So that was how I renewed my visa, and then I came back. So late when I worked in June, I was mostly just helping out in the analysis lab, since there was plenty of data points to collect at that point, everything coming down from end of fermentation, and they were doing mostly old school wet chemistry, so stuff that takes a lot longer. So the actual Lanyon titration for residual sugar that I don't think probably anyone uses at this point in Oregon anymore. So we had just flasks lined up when you were preparing those, as well as old school cash still. So again, there'd be a long row of flasks, and then I think we had 8 different heads for running free sulfite by AO. So again, end of fermentation, checking that first sulfur add, all of that sort of stuff. So a lot of manual, so extra hands wasn't a bad thing. So I stuck around and did that for a little bit, and then came back to
married and moved across the country.
Pretty much, but we didn't know exactly where we were going for a little bit. I'm trying to think of the timeline.
You came back straight into California, right?
Yeah.
So you came back to work at Frank Family.
Yeah. So I came back to California. I was in Pittsburgh for a short bit, and then went to California. I worked at Frank Family for pretty much a whole year, and then that's when I came back to Pittsburgh, and we got married.
Strictly to get married, and then we left again.
Yeah. But can you remember, what was the timeline that you interviewed at Intel in between when I was at Frank Family and we decided that we were moving to Oregon?
I don't know. It was probably May.
Okay.
I think it was right before right after my PhD defense. I may have waited a little bit too long to find a job, but it was very much we were looking on the West Coast somewhere where it was okay, we need wine and we need a reasonable commute to technology. And we need to be able to afford a house sometime in our lifetime. It very much lucked out that Intel had an opening for me. Trusadum took him in for his third harvest, and yeah, that was very lucky, I'd say, because otherwise I think it would have been a 3-hour commute anywhere in California.
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, Viña Santa Carolina, my first vintage, I picked just because it was an opportunity and that was the harvest that was approaching. And harvest abroad seems like something fun to do to start, I guess. And then when I was interviewing and trying to pick where I'd come back to the US at, after that, I looked at a variety of different places, mostly in California, because that was, again, I was watching wine jobs and who was posting. And I kind of picked Frank Family just because of the diversity of what they had. They had Zinfandel, they had Bordeaux varietals, they had Pinot and Chardonnay, they had a very big sparkling program. So it was kind of just like to try to experience as much as possible. That's how I ended up there. And I think at some point at that time, we were also starting to think about where we could land. Is like there are a decent amount of tech jobs in California, so it's like, will this be how we can like triangulate things later? But we definitely ended up in Oregon, but she got the job at Intel. And then Trisatum, picking to work there again as I interviewed different places when it seemed like we were heading towards Oregon. I was interviewing for kind of over that year in California, a mixture of like full-time and like harvest jobs. We were trying to figure out again where we'd be. I picked that just, James has a lot of Riesling. It was something that was an interest at the time to learn more about, something I hadn't touched or done from a winemaking perspective at that point with where I had worked. And then, he had all his other small lot stuff. And I wanted something a little bit different. Frank Family's, was, I think at the time, closer to 200,000 cases. So coming to Trisatum, be a little bit less of an intern, maybe a little bit more involved in some of the discussions and tasting, just based on the size of the team, the scale of the day. So that's how I ended up there. And then, after that harvest, I had a little bit of lull. So she got a dog, so I had something to do. We got a dog. But you got me a dog to keep me busy.
I got you a dog. I was like, I assure you, dogs are better than cats,
Yeah. She's also very allergic to cats, so there's that detail too. But with that, so I was kind of done at Trisatum end of October, because that was a little bit more normal of a harvest that year. But so from October to like January, I was searching for jobs and interviewing, and that's how I eventually got a job in the cellar at A to Z Wineworks, Rex Hill. So I started working there in January 2015, yeah.
Had either of you had any familiarity with Oregon before moving here?
No.
What were your initial impressions?
I really liked it, I guess.
Yeah, I think I was here first, right? And Dave.
Yeah, when you interviewed,
Yeah, I don't think I got lost that first time from the airport. If you turn the wrong direction when you come from the airport, you go straight to the Columbia River Gorge. And it's the most beautiful place to get lost in the entire world. And that was the second time we visited. I think we were together when we got lost there. And we're like, this is pretty awesome, but also, where's the highway? Where are we going?
It's like, we flew up here separately. I came from California, she came from Pittsburgh, and then I went and picked her up at the airport, and that's when we took the wrong turn and ended up in the gorge. Wrong way on 84. But we came up here to find a place to live, like an apartment or something to, start.
We were already
with.
sold in Oregon at that point, I think.
Yeah,
you come in, it's like, I know I was interviewing in May, I think, so it was just coming off the rainy season. Everyone I talked to came from California, and they were all complaining about the weather. And then this one manager came in and he was just like, hey, I'm from Pittsburgh. Have they all been complaining about the weather? And I'm like, yeah, they have. Is it really that bad? He's like, no, you're from Pittsburgh. You know real weather. This is a mist. You won't even notice it's raining. You're fine. So that settled any nerves that I had regarding the weather. And beyond that, it was like, we like skiing, we like hiking, we like being outside. Like those are the things we really enjoy. And Oregon really seemed to mesh with, the values of Oregon aligned with what we wanted to do. So I think it was a pretty easy decision once we sort of knew this place existed.
Yeah. I mean, I think the only downside here is like the lack of proximity to family. I mean, both of our parents are essentially retired now, but it still is a pretty long plane ride away.
There's always a connection flight.
So yeah, that too. Yeah. But I think that's like probably the only negative for us at this point with Oregon. Otherwise, it just feels like home. We're pretty happy here. So, I mean, her dad retired in July, mine retired in September. So I guess they're still figuring out retirement. We're in the early stages, so we'll see how family dynamics change as they like settle into retirement. That's a new thing for them as well. So, maybe family won't feel so far away now that they're retired and have the, the unlimited vacation. So.
all the PTO they want.
All the PTO they want, minus the house projects.
So Ben, you talked about, you had a chemistry background and a science background. You had done some preparation, you'd done UC Davis. I'm curious about getting into the cellar for the first couple of times. What were the surprises for you when it came to making wine? What was different than maybe you expected or maybe you were prepared for?
I mean, in Chile, I think the biggest surprise would probably have been twofold. It would have been the size of the tanks and the infrastructure within that winery. So we had they were probably 5-6 inch hard lines that plumbed from the crush pad up over the top of the winery in the ceiling. Some of them were manual valves, some of them were air valves, and some of them didn't open and some of them didn't close. So it was like a magical sort of thing where you had to know exactly where to move and plumb the lines and put it into that tank to you wouldn't, because if they were on the crush pad and you missed, it would be raining for a very long time before you could tell them to stop sending grapes from the destemmer into the tops of the tanks. So it was kind of this, you had to learn the flow of the system, and all of our tanks did have hot and cold glycol, but they were controlled by levers. So depending on the heat of the tank and how the fermentation was tracking, it was wide open cooling or quarter turn, half turn, 3/4, that's how we controlled heating and cooling. So it was a mixture of we had the system, we had hot and cold glycol, but it was obviously very, very manual, even on the 60,000 gallon tanks that we had in the facility. So that was, I think a little bit of an eye-opener in some ways. Now, thinking back, at that time I didn't really understand that would be anything different. I never experienced tank net controllers or something a little more sophisticated, automated that actually has a computer program, but that was interesting to see those big of tanks that we controlled in a very manual and automated way. And then they were building catwalks on these 10,000 liter tanks during harvest, which were the most fun to fill because you'd be trying to flip a hose in and out of the tank as you filled it from standing on a ladder, which was not really OSHA quote unquote approved, whatever sort of system. So the margin of safety maybe was questionable at times for that first harvest, but you kind of definitely learned to work with what you had.
Is it like that in the wineries here too?
No.
Okay, good. Sorry, my engineer brain is
a lot of wineries here, if you stand on top of a tank and do a punch down, you're tied into some sort of harness in a system. If you'd fall, the rope catches you before you hit the floor.
Good answer.
So, very, very different levels of acceptable, safety risk. I mean, in Chile, if we needed supplies, we weren't going to get them. If we ran out of additives, you picked something else. We weren't getting more. There wasn't a crush to cellar down the street. You didn't run somewhere and pick something up. Same with anything that had to be repaired. There was essentially a junkyard, and there was a guy that was a mechanic that he was just welding and fixing whatever random scraps they had to keep things moving. You think of the drawer of random parts that everyone has in their garage with different nuts and bolts and nails. That was on a larger scale on the side of the yard. If anything broke, we had to fix it. There wasn't a facility down the road that we could call in or someone that would come help us fix different aspects of whatever might break.
Not quite the pharmaceutical industry.
No, not very different from the internship I did at Amgen in undergrad, where I was in the equivalent of a clean room for organic chemistry. All the sophisticated fume hoods and tools that you could need. I mean, I didn't even have to clean from a graduate school perspective at Amgen. I didn't have to clean glassware. You had a dirty dish container. You put whatever you made dirty in there and someone else cleaned it. You went to a room and you got whatever clean stuff you needed. We didn't even wash our own glassware at Amgen as interns. I mean, the full-time staff didn't either, but as interns, we didn't have to do it as well. Whereas in graduate school, you cleaned everything up. You had all your stuff you had to take care of.
But clearly you enjoyed winemaking enough to keep doing it.
Yeah, I think I was intrigued and interested, so I kept going at that point. Yeah, and then coming back to the States, it was kind of interesting to see Frank family. We had definitely different sized tanks. We didn't have near as big sized tanks. Everything Chardonnay was barrel fermented, so we had Chardonnay barrels 5 high in a cold room. And most of I would say the winter portion of the year, December through probably April. When we started topping, there were so many barrels on site that we would just make a full circle and start over again. The group of us that was doing topping. So for the Chardonnay, that'd be stir, maybe add sulfur, top, and then for everything else, it was just check sulfur, add it, top, and then we would just cycle through all the barrels and come back, and that's pretty much all I did for 5 months. is just top different barrels and make our way through the facility. Because I think we had like 8,000 or 9,000 barrels on site. So, and if we weren't doing that, we were racking out of barrels and getting something ready for bottling. So I definitely got a crash course on any sort of wine movements during that period, into or out of the barrels that were being stored or fermented in.
So you mentioned earlier that A to Z was the first kind of step into a non-internship job in the industry. Tell me about finding that and choosing that spot and your initial role there.
So my initial role there, I was just a cellar hand, but after kind of a short period, the person that had kind of connected the cellar to bottling left, and I kind of just, for lack of a better word, like someone had to do it and I fell into the role. So then I was like connected to bottling, and just kind of the final flow of the wines out of like filtration and down to the bottling line, any final adjustments, and just making sure that like the flow of like we have wine to bottle every single day was ready, that wine was ready, checking all those boxes, working with the lab and winemaking. So just kind of connecting the cellar to the other pieces is some of that role, but then I also did any other general cellar stuff that needed done at that point. So I think finding the job, I interviewed a few places. That was the one that I got, which I think was a good thing. I still kind of don't have a great perspective outside of my own perspective of like this project, like how if you're a small brand, what happens the rest of the year, like there's not that much going on from like what you have to do perspective in the winery. So you do a lot of other things to help out with like the brand or the facility. At A to Z, we were just constantly moving wine. So from like a physical training perspective, learning about practical winemaking, like what, different ways to move wine around, whether it's gas or pumps, different pumps. Different ways with like smaller to larger lots, we had different filters that we'd work with. I think it was a great experience because we were constantly doing something that was like winemaking in the cellar. There was always something that was heading to the bottling line, and they were all different wines, from like the A to Z to like the Rex Hill scale. So like there's different, practical aspects that if you just had a university education, you may not learn all of those diverse things. So I think it was a good spot for me to land for a first full-time job, just from what I was able to be exposed to in such a short period of time. It was just a lot of learning that like a smaller facility, you wouldn't see all that.
You also gained a lot of mentors, right? And like people that you've leaned on in the industry, right? Like A to Z is such a well-connected, established brand in the Valley.
Yeah, so I think at that time, and then I continued to work with Anna Matzinger, but she consulted when I moved over to Montanore. But like, I interacted with Anna because Michael and her, up until like very recently, made their wine there. So like, we would always prep whatever Anna was doing before she came in, but she wanted to do all of her own wine stuff as much as possible. So we'd like prepare and clean stuff so she could just rack when she came in or whatever she was working on. So that's when I first met Anna. Obviously, I worked with Michael. He was the executive winemaker at the time, and still is. But like Anna then was also consulting when I moved over to Montanore before Harvest 2017. So she was a consultant there. So then I started to work a little bit more, I'd say, from like a winemaking side as opposed to just like talking with her. And she's probably been my biggest mentor, I would say, in the Oregon wine industry over the years. Just from the 5 years I was at Montanore, tasting with her, talking with her, she'd come by multiple times a year, more often during harvest, less the rest of the year. But yeah, we've continued to talk back and forth. We have some vineyards now that cross over from the fruit that we source with them. So, that's been kind of fun to talk about, sending pictures back and forth, and, as we both go out and scout and sample and see how things are progressing along, how the fermentations are going. So she's certainly been someone we've even leaned on from like the compliance and logistics side, since, we've stored our wine and have some of the similar crossovers. So if we have questions about like nuances of the software and stuff, I've asked her that even. So it's been nice over the years. I think I owe Anna a lot of wine based on the amount that she's given me over the years for free and not taking payment. I mean, we'd ask her to bring some of her wine by at Montanore because we wanted to drink some of her wine. And very rarely was I given a bill or allowed to pay. So, and then even when I have paid it, I think the one time I bought a bottle of her Chardonnay and she filled a case for me because I had to go to her house to get it. So, she's been great in multiple ways over the years. from just, mentorship from like top to bottom. Very, very giving of information and of wine, so.
Pause the winemaking there for just a second and pop back over to Stephanie for a moment. So you mentioned Intel, you've been at Intel since you guys got to Oregon. Give me a little rundown of the work you've done there and maybe some of the highlights of your time at Intel.
Sure, for a winemaking podcast. So I got hired in.
It's an oral history podcast.
I got hired into components research, which is the research division of Intel that creates new processes on wafers. Basically, they're the ones making sure Moore's law stays alive for 20 plus years. So I guess making sure Moore's law stays alive and work about 10 to 20 years into the future, right? They partner with universities and then transfer it over to development to TD, which is the primary, like most of the people in Oregon do development. So yeah, I got hired as back-end integration, which means that I was making the wires that connect the transistors on the chips that Intel has. My job is essentially moving wafers through the fab. So I know a little bit about a lot of things. I got caught up in one technology that sort of taught me the front end, which was making the new transistors. And that sort of kept me busy for, I think, about 4 or 5 years. At that point, I sort of looked at what I was doing, and I was like, I need a change. And I jumped over to quantum computing, which was more working in the research space. I worked with the university in the Netherlands and had a small group. I came in as an engineer, ended up managing a group there of people that were designing and then building future quantum computing chips. I had that role for 6 years in the quantum group. They were awesome. They still are awesome. I looked at what I was doing, what Intel was doing, how they're doing right now, which is to say going through a lot of transitions in the industry, and decided I want to go jump out of research. I just needed out of research at that point and went over into a more of a customer-focused foundry role, doing the same, coordinating the wafers through the fab, but the goal is really to interface with customers and make sure in our new foundry model and make sure that they have what they need. So that's what I do currently. And then in all of my free time on nights and weekends, work in the wine industry.
Do you see connections there between sort of the engineering side and wine?
Oh gosh, all of these crazy stories that Ben comes in, like, emptying a tank from the bottom, not knowing if it's empty or not, and then flooding the winery, like that makes my engineering mind explode. I'm like, I could build you a sensor. I don't know if I can make it cheap enough, but I could build you one to let you know, like, happy face, sad face, is this empty? But beyond that, problems are generally, they come down to making sure that people are talking to each other and making sure that the systems work together, and whether it's compliance and making sure your bottles are in the right place, and then that inventory is moved over to the fulfillment house that can then ship across the state, and you've got all the states in line, right? Like, that's just a system to make sure that X is talking to Y is talking to Z. And that is fundamentally, I guess, how I approach most problems. So that, yeah. And I guess also doing research. It's also marketing for me. That's how I've been successful in my job, is like, I have to convince people who want to sell things to run something that's higher risk. And I've always had to explain why, right? And that, when you boil it down to the absolute fundamentals, is marketing, right? And it's, we need to sell something and you need to figure out why. So they're not very related, but I've extrapolated a couple of things. You will not find me in the cellar, though. Like, I'm very happy to not be a technical role in the wine industry. I'll do all the rest of it, and he could be our technical expert, which is great.
Defining roles is important.
Yeah.
So then you mentioned next step for you was Montanore. Tell me about taking that step.
So I moved over there, and essentially an assistant winemaker role that didn't exist or hadn't existed for a little bit there. The first big project that I had was getting a database up and running that they had purchased and were paying for, but wasn't really used for almost a full year. Some of that was like the exposure I had to, they were hoping the exposure I had to Vintrace when I was at A to Z, which was the software program we used, would help with this, teaching myself and figuring out how to get all of our stuff into the database. So we picked a cutoff point, which was like harvest. So we started from 2017's onward. We backed up whatever few things we had over vintaged into it, and then started with 17 into the software. Pretty quickly figured out that software was not a very good software system for how it would track things. It was almost like worse than like a spreadsheet for like the way you would move things around, and when you blend, it would do weird things if you didn't do it a specific way. That violations of like this shouldn't allow you to overwrite things in this way, type errors within the software. So we did then pretty much after a year shift everything over to, well actually less than a year, shift everything over to Vintrace, since that was the one I had the most experience with and could like get going faster. So that was kind of the initial hurdles of me starting there, as well as just, new winery, getting to know the team, how wine was made there, improvements that we could make. I did bring a lot of like the bottling stuff, QC stuff that I had done at A to Z across and integrate that into like Montenor's bottling program. And then my cross-flow experience from A to Z was also, I think, a big startup thing, because again, when I came in August, we were filtering wine for bottling, and they had a new cross-flow, and someone had to learn how to use it. So it wasn't one I had used prior, but like they're all somewhat similar. No one there had experience ever doing cross-flow before, so that was kind of my initial year. And then going from there, we had some new vineyards we brought online with the Ackley Beverage ownership, and some new brands we had to work on developing. So I got a very good picture at that time with the launch of one of the brands about how, the build it and they will come is not like a thing. Like you really do have to get out there and hand sell. You can't just launch something online, even necessarily a low price point. Like there's a lot of like visibility that you have to gain from working with partners and people and hand selling. Like I had seen how that just doesn't work if it wasn't obvious before, but the way we do sales and marketing in the wine industry is certainly different than like, putting out a commercial for like the Super Bowl. Like that's not, there's a lot of that personal relationship. And I think even like the sales dynamic is shifting harder that way now. It's like people want a story, they don't want just like a blank label. That storytelling capacity, that knowing who's there, and like those like special moments, like, we've kind of tried to construct some of our brand identity around that, I would say. And some of that I learned during my time at Montenor. You talk about I learned a lot of winemaking stuff. We certainly had different problems. We had different equipment, failures, things that you had to fix, winemaking problems that you always come about. But like I also learned, a lot about this other side too. And that role was, again, you have some crossover.
You were assistant winemaker there, right? So it was his next step up too, which I think is worth noting.
Yeah. And then, we were made with biodynamic and organic, so I did all the certification paperwork. It made it a lot easier coming out of like Vintrace once we had that going. So I got to experience kind of all of that too. That was all definitely new challenges and learning. And then, through that community, I connected with a lot of other people, because we all have to deal with the same certifiers. So we all have our own little complaints or gripes or problems that we have to go through when they show up, because quite often some of them, they aren't necessarily wine people. So to explain to them like the flow of a winemaking year and why you can or can't do certain things right now, because you've come in August and we made this wine last fall. There's those discussions, if they're used to certifying dairies or like a brewery, it's like we're not on the same sort of turn that they are. So, yeah.
So at what point did the idea of making wine for yourself become something in your head?
I think when I started in the wine industry, that was something I wanted to do. And I don't remember exactly when I changed my mind about that, but it might have been somewhere Frank Family, or when we got to Oregon, I was like, I adamantly don't want to have my own business again. It was like, no, working for other people is great because it's all their money, their risk, and like, this is fine. I think during the pandemic in 2020, I think much like all of us started thinking about different things in our lives when we got locked in our houses. I think that was when I started to be like, I don't know if I ever want to make wine. I want to make wine, but I don't think I want to make it for someone else. So that's when we started kind of coming up with like, what sort of exit strategy should I have to be able to like do that? And I guess for me mentally, it would be easier to make wine at least to start for ourselves, if I wasn't making wine like full time for someone else. Because the busiest, most labor intensive part of the year is harvest. So if I can be more available during harvest than I would be if I'm making someone else's wine, that made more sense to me. There's certainly advantages, I think, for some of the small brands that make their own wine within the facility that they work, maybe mostly from a cost perspective, but at the same time, it's like you are always split and more distracted.
So tell me about putting that into play then. You start to think it out during the pandemic. As you start to plan it out, what's your first step?
So we go through 2020. We have our first child at the beginning of 2021. And I think most of 2021, I was trying to figure out what I would do next. So I was like looking for jobs and or interviewing different places. Where would I go? What would that mean? And I also kind of felt like at that point, and again, some of this might be like just thinking during 2020.
Staring at the ceiling.
Reflecting, it was also kind of like, what are the different options to make this happen? So it wasn't necessarily, I did do some interviewing for different winemaking roles as well, but I felt like I kind of like capped out my ability to learn things at Montanore after, by the end of it, that would have been 4 harvests, but by in 2021, 5 harvests, 4.5 years. I feel like I kind of maxed out my ability to learn within that facility, within that team, but also like contribute. I didn't feel like I was contributing from like a work perspective, but I wasn't making like dynamic change. I wasn't really we weren't really like evolving in what we were doing. We had reached a certain level that we were happy with, and I think that was, general consensus. So like there wasn't much room for even like contribution, I felt like at that point. So I was kind of looking, for something else, I would say. So I interviewed for a couple different, I think initially they were more sales roles, but on like the technology side of the wine industry, and that's how I ended up essentially having a role that was created for me within Admeo, the current company that I work for, as like a product specialist. We work across food and beverage, but mostly enology companies in the U.S. And then we have partner companies, joint ventures that come out of Biosystems in Barcelona, Spain. So that's most of the instruments you see in the valley that are Admeo instruments or the Biosystems instruments, as well as now Steroglass at Perugia, Italy. So like there's a dynamic worldwide partnership between like Admeo in the U.S., Steroglass in Italy, and Biosystems with all their subsidiaries worldwide. So there's exchange of information and technology between, let's say, the 3 companies. Here in the U.S., we're sales, marketing, and like technical support and service. We don't have any of the manufacturing here. All the manufacturing is back in Spain and Italy, depending on the technology. So that's the instruments she's alluding to that are in our garage, or like the instruments from those companies. Because in my role as a product specialist, I do a lot of our technical support. I do application development, whether that's like myself working with one of the parent companies or universities within the U.S. So like the very, very small sales role that I have is for the universities. So like last week, I took a pause on my bonding leave and ran up to Washington State and did an instrument installation with them. They have pretty much every one of our instruments now on site. So that was like the slight break that I've done in the second part of my bonding leave, which now I'm on pretty much just like Steph through mid-December. So the paid leave organ leave that exists now that didn't exist when we had our first job.
It's a whole brand new world now.
I know.
So, new day job, continuing day job.
Sure.
You're thinking about a brand. What prompts you to finally take the leap?
I would say when I took the job at Admeo, that was part of my interview process. As I said, I wanted to do this, and they were supportive of that. So like that was part of the interview discussion with them, and certainly like I don't know what initially they may or may not have thought the benefits crossover would be, but like because I have like my own wine now, I know exactly what it's doing at any given moment. I've used that to produce like different levels of data and test different things on the instrument that like, Biosystems, Steroglass, they're like a development company. They don't necessarily they're not making wine. So the wine they have is coming from outside, or it's probably mostly commercial finished wine. or it could be even more, I think, not necessarily sterile, but like, aqueous solutions that they use to QC the instruments. So like now I have a practical medium. Wine's obviously more complicated than like all the compounds that are in it at any given time, because there's interactions between those different compounds that, make it a very dynamic medium and complex medium, despite the basic chemistry that we essentially do on it from an analysis standpoint. So with that, I think there's been advantages, because now I can start to like branch out and offer different levels of like application support because of the knowledge I've gained from working with the instruments. So that's where my role is kind of developed within the company, I would say. And I do kind of sit alone between like the service department, which is like the mechanical hardware side, and like the sales, where I support both, but kind of exist in neither full time, I would say.
And what triggered you to start the winery there? I think you came to me and you're like, there's grapes for sale. Can I buy them?
Yeah.
That was essentially it. Like
that would be that.
Like what triggered? What was that initial thought process? I've never actually asked.
I mean, we had talked about it when I took this job, I would say, but in 2023 we were considering it, and then I broke my leg, so that was kind of a full year. Like it was like, okay, we can't do this year. That was in March, but I knew it was going to be a long road back. So it was kind of like my second job was going to be rehabbing that injury. So I think at that point we were a little bit more serious, but it was more finding the right opportunity. So a place to make the grapes that made sense, cost-wise, location-wise, and then finding some grapes that are available. 2022 and 2023 weren't necessarily the best years to buy grapes in Oregon as well. So that's certainly why we didn't do it in 22, is there wasn't much available and it was expensive and probably not worth what you were paying for it to get it, just coming off of the poor fruit set in 21 and the fires in 20. So I think that would be the slow roll into finding fruit. The first I think trigger fruit where I said there's grapes available is I had kind of gone back and forth talking to Ponzi. Like I've known most members of that winemaking team, like both past and present over the years pretty well, just connections with Montanor. I knew JP when he was there before he left, and I think now he's down at Schramsberg. We ran into each other just randomly recently through like my day job with Ad Mayo, so that was kind of fun to catch up with him. And the current team with Max, like I've known them for years. There's a nice proximity to our house, and just it worked out as like I'm small enough to like fit in kind of under the door as like a small custom crush client. They also have one of our instruments there for analysis, so I think for them they've noticed dynamic benefits of me being around at Harvest if something happened. I'm on-site technical support instead of remote technical support, and certainly have maybe a deeper knowledge than like the average enologist even that runs the instrument every day. So there's been some exchanges, like mutual benefits with my like analytical experience specifically as well as generally, and then it's not hard for me to pop over there. It's only 20 minutes from our house, so that kind of works nicely for us. From like I can go over there, but I'm not like driving an hour somewhere to go check on our wines.
So once that decision is made, once you have fruit and you have a place, tell me about the rest of the logistics, coming up with a name, coming up with the plan of who's going to handle the various roles. How did the first kind of year unfold for you?
Pretty rapidly, because I think we got some of Ponzi had some extra Chardonnay, so we purchased a couple tons of some of their extra Chardonnay from Avellana and Isimo Vineyard, which is what's in our inaugural Laurelwood District Cuvée, which, at some point I maybe would have considered putting these separate, but there was a little bit of imbalance in the chemistry, so instead of manipulating the wine, we blended this into like a cuvée. The two vineyards are, separated kind of on either side of the winery. They're very close to being what you could almost consider a single vineyard, even though they're not just from like a proximity standpoint. So that was like the first fruit, and that was June. And then it kind of, I was talking with people, I have connections both, through Ponzi, but also other areas. So just like what fruit's available, are we interested in it, go visit and taste. And then for our inaugural year, we just ended up with buying some of Dave Page's RPG fruit and then some of fruit from Luke and Emily from their Gemini vineyard. That's probably by far the closest vineyard we source from to our house, just above Sherwood. So that's the closest drive, at least for from a fruit source for us from home. But yeah, just kind of just snowballed, just connections and talking to people. Well, at some point when people know you're looking for fruit and the year 24, you will get offers. People will come to you being like, do you want some fruit? How much?
They kept being like, do you want more?
Yeah. Yeah, and then that whole summer I was trying to find, then we had to find barrels. I went back to one of the cooperages that I worked with for years in Montenor, Rousseau, bought some barrels that were they brought over to the US but no one had purchased, so they were just down in Fairfield in storage, a year old. So new barrels but never filled. So just kind of slowly figuring that all out. So I did all these initial winemaking logistics. You at least initially just moved money around so we could pay bills.
Yeah.
Because now
That was sort of the thing. He's like, so I'm going to buy
income.
grapes. And I'm like, hold up. We don't have a business. So we brainstormed the name. I forget how we landed on Finite, the specific story, but we were looking for just a good name. Bojarski and Eyer are not good names. No one can say them. You can't combine them. We tried for our wedding. It was very bad. # no one could spell it. So we were just like, what could we make a meaningful story out of? And I think that's sort of where we ended on Finite, right? Do you remember the actual discussion there?
Well, at least with our names, I don't think either of them exist within the wine industry from a trademark standpoint. But talking with Anna over the years, she has told me multiple times people will avoid their wine because they're afraid to say Matzinger Davies, which to me doesn't sound like a hard to say name, but between that and Gewürztraminer, because we had talked about why people won't order Gewürztraminer because they can't say it, so they're afraid to say it wrong, get humiliated. So people, it's probably more a US thing than maybe a European thing, but we won't order or touch something that we can't pronounce. So it was all right, the name has to be something that's a word people can say.
At the very fundamental level.
At the very fundamental level, that was the basic standpoint. And I had brainstormed a very long list of names, long list of which most of which she hated.
He pulled from his backcountry skiing hobby.
But I had a long list of just kind of almost word vomit on a page, just a long list of words and names and how can we use this? What does this mean if we use it? Because I had been stuck in bed in 23 with a broken leg, so I had plenty of time to scribble on pieces of paper. You can only watch and read so many books and movies and television shows before you lose your mind when you're stuck in bed for 8 weeks, walking to the bathroom and back pretty much. So that be where that name was at least at some point populated on a page, and then we started.
Find it on the page?
Yeah, Finite was on there.
Okay, cool. That's how we found it.
Finite was on that page, and then I think as we. You agreed that was one you didn't hate, as you said it. We slowly started thinking about how would you build a brand identity, an actual brand, not just.
You look at the vibe of Finite, right? What does it mean?
Yeah.
Right, and he wants small lot wines. That was what you wanted to make, was small lot, single vintage, just a small distribution, right? We don't want to grow too big, and that's Finite wine, right? But then Finite also, we want to make sure we're focusing on sustainability, right? And we use the Ravino bottles. We don't have corks and wax and all that stuff you just throw away. And then also the corks that we use are biocompatible, I believe is the word they use for that one.
The DM agglomerated cork. So it's a more sustainable use even than just corks as a natural closure are very sustainable. As you plant a tree, it grows for many years. You shave the bark off, the tree continues to grow. They are by far the most sustainable closure, but when you can grind up and purify the cork and put it back together, it becomes even more sustainable because now you're not even looking for the perfect punches out of the tree. You can work with the whole cork bark as it comes off.
Ben came into this coming off of trade shows knowing exactly what we were going to bottle into, right? We had to make a decision on the label because you need the label design and between two different paper types basically, and that was it. And the embellishments, because otherwise he's I've already talked to all of these people. This is exactly what I want to bottle into. We're conscientiously making decisions on what grapes are growing, right? So Finite Resources was also a plant Finite, right? And then if you look at why we use wine, especially now with the family, you've got finite time, and you've got people and family, and we wanted our wines to bring people together, right? And I think that sort of fills in that brand story, right? Like finite was just, it was a short word that people can say, and it's impactful, and it sort of just makes you realize what you have and want to come together. And that's what we sort of settled on, right? And then after that, we sort of looked at how are we going to build this business, right? How do you want to structure it? Because realistically, looking at Ben's background, he could also probably do consulting or something, right? Like, can we build it in a way that we have flexibility to let him do a couple of things? So our business is actually filed as Finite Fermentation Project. That's our LLC, and then we're doing business as brands for Finite Cellars, which will be the wine brand. But then if he wants to do something else, we can build off of that, right? I think at one point you said you wanted to work with our mechanical engineering friend to make tools or something.
Yeah,
right?
well, that's another
Opportunities for
wild
growth, right?
side project.
We'll open. We wanted to build it in such a way that it made sense that we could grow, but then also just had that short, impactful name that people can say. And then I think maybe my job didn't lead to enough creativity, so started doing logo design. I said, let me take a stab at this first, get whatever's in my head on paper, and then if people hate it, we'll bring design experts in, right? Because I don't know design fundamentals, but I know what I like. I'm a consumer, so maybe if I want to sell to people like me, that I can start at least. What would my eye get drawn to on a shelf? And I think that's sort of then where we said, okay, what does our brand look like? And we started stepping through like the logo design and the name and the messaging that we have, right?
It's been a step-by-step process for sure.
Yeah.
One thing at a time.
And then at the same time, I'm like, okay, but you also want money, so let me make some spreadsheets, right? Yeah. And figure out, how you go about paying for a winery, what are funding options that we should have, what are we comfortable taking from our own, personal funding and stuff like that, and then what does growth look like? Also, can you tell me what a year looks like so we can plan a social media calendar and bills and stuff like that? So just a lot of Excel.
Which I think you enjoy and are good at.
Yeah, but we have a pretty solid, we found a good lawyer that we ended up working with. Whenever they came back with Finite, we filed for a trademark and ended up getting flagged for a beer that had a very different brand identity, very different name, but Finite was in the name. So we had to do some back and forth there to make sure that we could use this for wine, so strictly wine. You won't see Finite beer coming from us. We're not allowed to use it.
We can just do wine.
But that's
wine
fine. We're not interested in beer, so it's fine. So we have a good relationship with a lawyer now. We've got, my goal is to get things set up and then bring in experts so that they can take us to the next level. Because I don't know how to run a business, but I can ask the challenging questions to get things set up so that they at least make sense, and I can track numbers and stuff. It all comes down to numbers and people. So that's sort of on the business side how we've been setting it up, where Ben is then running around finding grapes, finding places to make the grapes, buying barrels, and I'm just in the background trying to keep up.
I'm curious about that part because obviously you mentioned compliance and all that being part of your work. Tell me about sort of being dropped into that without background on it. What's the most complicated part of?
Oh, so I grew up in Pennsylvania, and I know that they just have liquor stores, right? They had beer in the grocery store. Yeah, the whole state. I knew that compliance was a thing, and it's very hard to get things into places, and that I did not want to do that paperwork because I had an hour at the end of a very long Intel day where I'd stop working at 11 p.m. and then I could do a little bit of this stuff, right? So we're just like, let's set this up so we can grow, but also so that we're not the limiting factor, right? So there's a company called Vino Shipper. They basically buy your wine and then sell it under your name through their brand or through their company so that you can ship it to 40 plus states. And that just made sense. Through Ben's connections with Anna and other people in the Valley, we know that Northwest Distributions is the foremost place to store your wine. They have Wine Co. They do fulfillment. They work directly with Vino Shipper. No one has to talk. We don't have to connect any of those branches once they're together, right? And that made sense from the business perspective, right? So you set up that sort of compliance thing. You talk to each person, try to figure out who owns what, I think I have a PowerPoint presentation with a flow chart saying, okay, these are all the arrows moving, and then I flashed it to someone in sales. I'm like, okay, or in customer service, I'm like, who does this? And then they told me who did it, and then we sort of know the flow, right? We did our release 2 weeks ago, two weeks ago now. And things have been delivered to other states. So as far as I'm concerned, it works.
We'll find out when we do our taxes, right?
No, it works. I'm confident. I'm not worried.
If our accountant gets mad, we know we messed something up.
Yeah.
Hopefully not.
Yeah. But yeah, so that was sort of right. It was just like, there is a solution because everyone else is doing this. And then you just have to figure out what the right solution is for the size business that we have and what we want to tackle on our own versus what we don't want to tackle on our own. And then, now that we have income coming in, what are we going to start, getting professionals assigned to help us?
Where do we want to invest, I guess?
Yeah, where do you want to invest or into the next level? So we also take crash courses in Canva design and Instagram and all that fun stuff as well.
Well, do you want to talk about the labels? Because you did all the labels in Canva to start.
There you go.
This is our label, yeah. No, I mean, I don't know. I designed them. I had a vision in my head, like I said, about the logo. And then I was like, what could we do? And I kind of liked the F. I came up with the shape and then just happened to find a font that matched it exactly. And it kind of looks like a broken infinity sign, which plays along with the word finite. So yeah, there's been some discussion about what the half circle is. Could it be an eclipse? Could it be a ring? I don't know.
Everyone has a different interpretation, which is
and
kind
we'll
of
let that happen, right? And we didn't mean to make an artistic label, but it's simple and I don't know. Hopefully it works on the shelf, right? So learned a lot about compliance as well in terms of what needs to be on a label to pass COLA. But it's been fun to do those sort of things and get a vision out there at least and come up with, yeah. It's like, I don't know, what do you want? Okay. So, but yeah, and then, Ben comes in and he's just like, this is what we need from a sales perspective, right? This is what you need from a winemaking perspective, what I want on the front label. This is what I need the brand to say, because realistically, he's the one going out there. He's the face of this. I'll be in front of this camera and I hope to be in front of very few cameras after this. So, the label tells the story, or it starts the story, but we don't want it to be the whole story. Right? We're not going to go up against people who have art. Like, there's so many brands that have just these giant artistic labels, and I think we want the wine to tell the story, and the people behind the wine and the grapes and everything to be part of the story, and less, the label itself.
Yeah. Well, I think also, like, stylistically, we both like things that are cleaner. Not necessarily like sterile, but like just like a little bit more like organized. Yeah. So, I think recently we had a discussion about how we might like tweak and redesign the label for next year. But again, you start looking at everyone else's labels, and not saying I'm going to make it look like theirs, but how do they organize the same things we both have on our labels on the front or the back?
Like the Ravino stuff, like how big is that versus, we want to make it obvious this time because we do want people to return the bottles. Like the Ravino bottle reuse system is specifically to like reduce the carbon footprint of your wine, right? So you use it and then you return it instead of recycling it. And that's something where we needed to make sure it was front and center.
And like right now it's just an Oregon thing. So like, I think my parents said the bottles that they took back to Pennsylvania when they were here, they're going to bring back next time and give to us. But like, that's probably not a realistic expectation for most of the country that they're going to ship us the bottles back after we've shipped it to Pennsylvania, Connecticut. I'm sure there will be some people that would try it, but hopefully as this grows, it'll become more than just like a Pacific Northwest thing. I know they're starting to like push into California a little bit as well as into like Washington. So like I think that ecosystem will continue to grow as they gain momentum. Because I mean, Ravino as a company is from a glass production and sales standpoint is kind of only like 3 years old. Like the oldest wines that were bottled in that are not, almost most of them being released like very recently in the last year or so. So, as much as it's started, there's still a whole infrastructure that's being slowly built out with that. So we're at the beginning.
Yeah, and we're fully committed. Like all of our wines are in Ravino. I think some people put some of their, but they're not ready to commit their whole practice to it, but we're just, we're going to just come in and start at where we want the product to be, right?
So you mentioned you just released a few weeks ago. Tell me about first wine. Tell me about how the release has gone.
It's been interesting to see like who's reached out. We did like a launch with Helvetia Farm Market out in Hillsborough, where they have like a Ravino bottle club. So all the wines that are part of the club are other Ravino bottles. So it's just Ravino bottles on the table, and if you
20 open bottles.
Yeah, 20 open bottles. Like
anyone
all
who's
across,
listening, they should go join the club, the wine club.
So the deal is that you can sign up. You provide like your information, and then you can either pay a tasting fee or you can buy 4 bottles. So once you buy 4 bottles, you're into the club. So if you bring back those 4 bottles or any 4 other Ravino bottles and exchange them, I think you get 20% off all of your next 4 bottles that you purchase. So then the idea is you just keep bringing the bottles back to the farm market. And again, it doesn't have to be the initial ones you purchased, and you can come back intermittently. It's not like a required shipment club. It's a kind of ad hoc, you come shopping club, and they host, 2 days. I think it's usually the last weekend, so Friday, Saturday, the last weekend of the month. Although coming up, it's going to shift a little bit just because the last weekends of the coming months are Thanksgiving and Christmas, so they're going to move it, I think, a little bit for both of those. But you can show up, you can taste the wine. There's usually some small food on offer, or you can purchase food from the market as well. But yeah, then taste through the wines and pick which ones you want to take home again. And again, just the idea is that continuing cycle, and they're looking to grow that there. So that was where we did our initial launch, just because of the whole Ravino thing. I wanted to support that initiative for our initial placement. So that's the only place that you can find our wine outside of the website at this point in Oregon. So start talking to more people in the coming weeks. But yeah.
And we're primarily focused on direct-to-consumer sales through the website, though. So we had, I'd say, a really nice friends and family turnout. I've got one very supportive cousin who married into my family in Virginia, who's just driving it. Thanks, Dan, if you listen to this. So there's been a lot of enthusiasm on that side, which is awesome to see. And even if they don't, want to pay the shipping fees or buy the bottles at this point, rough economic times for a lot of people, right? That you get a lot of messages just saying like, hey, we're really excited for you guys. Like one day I'm going to try them. And that means the world to us too, I think. So I think we're just looking to slowly grow and get our name out there beyond, we've got a couple people that found us otherwise, and then friends and family networking, and just trying to get brand recognition out there as well. So it wasn't a huge launch, but I think it was good for sort of our scale and our size.
Yeah, I think, we were talking about it in the car today. It's like, there's like 2 sides. You want to sell out of your wine eventually, but you don't want to happen too quickly. So there's kind of that fine balance of production and sales where you want it to have a flow to it. So like you wouldn't want to launch and sell out of everything, which I think I've had some friends ask me, they're like, when are you guys going to sell out? I was like, not for a while, but I also don't want to like run out of wine 6 months after the launch, because then, if you have any placements, there's a wall. So it's, again, it's all about that balance, I think. And, I think slow and steady isn't the worst thing sometimes. And again, from my time at Montanar, I talked about that other brand launch, I have no expectation that necessarily people are just going to go randomly buy a bunch of wine, whether or not they know us or we produced it or whatever, because like everyone wants to try often before they buy. So again, that's, getting it out different places, working with partners, that helps.
Yeah, and I think we're going to figure out how to get in front of more people, right? Yeah. Just typical challenges of a wine brand that doesn't have a tasting room yet. So, but it's sort of by design. So that's.
Yeah, tasting rooms do cost money, so there's always that to consider too.
It's not the strongest industry right now.
Yeah.
So tell me about, as you look ahead, what are the next steps in terms of growth? Is it making more wine? Is it making different kinds of wine? What are the next kind of goals for you?
So, we've already made the 25s, which we made before. Basically, we decided what we were making in 25 before we even put the 24s in bottle, because that's just how it goes. That's kind of the game, unless you have like an aromatic white or a rosé that you would bottle and release earlier. That's kind of the game. You're already into year 2 before year 1's even tested. or footprints are out there. So we shifted some of the fruit sourcing from year one. We still have a Pinot from Gemini and RPG, slightly bigger, just to have a little bit more to work within. Like the barrel oak program is kind of helpful. And there's also just like a certain scale that it's easier to make quality wine when you have a certain size, like ferment with like capacity for maintaining heat versus like a very small vessel. It just doesn't work the same way, or it's always more difficult. So, we still have those two Pinots. We added Folly of Man Vineyard, a little bit smaller fruit tonnage than the Gemini and RPG. So that would be the red side, essentially, for 25 that we have aging in barrel and going through ML at the moment. And then on the whites, we just talking with Ponzi and the dynamics of like kind of trying to keep some level of consistency of fruit. We just have the Isimo vineyard this year at a slightly reduced tonnage from last year. So it'll just be that single vineyard. And then that Isimo in this wine is like 25% of the blend. So, we had that fruit last year, liked it. So then we just kind of honed in on that for a single vineyard in 25 from there. And then we picked up Pearlstad. So that's like one of the crossovers with Anna. We actually we had sections of the Wente block that were side by side with Matzinger Davies. So, again, that was like, I texted Anna, said we needed some Chardonnay. Did she know of anyone? She connected me with Ken. So, just kind of how those all happen. And I think even at the time, the fruit Ken thought he had available for me, that changed. Someone else dropped out that was getting that Wente. So we ended up being side by side with Anna and Michael, not initially, but just from when I went down and visited Ken, there was more fruit available than initial discussions. So
for 25, then we're just trying to hone in on the story of like comparing different vineyards and different growing regions, different AVAs, and building the brand recognition. I think that's really important for us to make sure that before we scale up production, make sure we can sell it, do a proof of concept like that. You're not allowed to buy more than you have now until we figure out. Right, so I'm here for the brakes, to hit the brakes, and to say, whoa, whoa, whoa. And so that's what 2025 looks like. And 26, I think you said you wanted to scale a little bit more, right, focus on sales for the next couple of years, and then once we are in the groove, right, then consider what does the next step look like. And I think that's the pragmatic approach to it that we're trying to take. I'll be forcing us to take.
Yeah.
But I'm always open to his dreams.
I think, if nothing else, from my time in Oregon, from like A to Z onwards, I've learned that like it is really easy to make a lot of wine quickly. It is very much easy to do that, like just scale up, make a pile of wine. Selling it's the tricky part. And
maintaining quality, right? You need to make good wine, right? And I think that's what we want, small batch, good wine.
Yeah. And I think, I've focused on a lot of things to try to make sure all of our fermentations get to completion, just from like the years of different things that I've done in the wine industry. And from I think from a brand perspective, like, you can do all sorts of like fancy marketing and labeling and things that look cool or drive people's attention to your brand. But at the end of the day, you're not going to get a return customer if they don't enjoy what's in the bottle. Part of that is certainly story, but part of that is certainly like what, people drink wine, I think, generally because they like how it tastes. They like how it pairs with food, or like, like they're not going to continuously go back to a wine that they didn't really like how it tasted. They're not going to buy that again. So like that's the most important thing. And I think then to convince people to buy it, they may want to try it. So I think that's the next step for us, is that brand recognition, is to get it in front of more people. And that might be through festivals or like wholesale partners like Helvetia, just like finding those right partnerships and events while still not spreading ourselves too thin, I think, personally.
Maybe hire someone to help us.
Yeah.
The boring stuff. But I think, and we also benefit from Ben, like, also being a really good chef. Like, he just cooks all of the time, and he understands the taste dynamics, and I'll be like, this wine tastes weird here. And he'll explain what that is. Right? If anyone ever sees me, if you don't want to talk about the technical aspects of wine, I'm the one to talk to, and Ben is the expert that will explain it all to you and tell you what to pair it with. And I think that's, he's designing wines. Drove this into my head last week, right? He's designing wines that go good with food and without food, but they do go well with food, and highlighting pairings and stuff is probably finding ways to pair with partners would be awesome.
Do you have an ultimate goal in mind? Is there something that you would like to achieve with Finite Cellars that would make it a success?
Well, I think that when we started this, I was like, I don't want this to be a vanity project, or I want it to be profitable at some point. So I think that is it is a business. I want it to be profitable. I know there's people within the Oregon wine industry as well as the wine industry that they have another business, and this might be a tax write-off to balance those two books. I mean, but for us, it will take time. There's no realistic expectation that it's going to be it won't be 10 years before we can say we're truly profitable. But I think we want this to work from a business perspective as much as a winemaking perspective.
Mm-hmm. You said you want to sort of cap it at a certain volume, right?
Yeah.
You want to maintain it small. We don't want to be.
Yeah, I don't want to make an A to Z type brand or a union brand. That's not my end game.
Now maybe his interest will shift, and we have a different brand, right? But Finite's going to be a small brand that.
Yeah, Finite, but we make 200,000 cases. That just doesn't really vibe with the brand at the end of the day. Yeah, I think the number I've thrown out there is somewhere in the couple thousand cases. So somewhere between the 3,000 to 5,000 cases. But some of that's going to be how we're selling, what we're making, where we're making it. I think those will all be incremental things that we'll have to figure out. And then, maybe how both of our other careers progress as well.
So in terms of goals, we don't have a set goal. It's sort of this is one of the adventures of our life, I think, right? We've always, we started going on adventures before we were married. And this is just sort of an adventure. We want a well-planned adventure, right? We're not going into the wilderness without a plan. We want to be profitable because it is a business, but we'll see what it grows into, I think, right?
Stephane, you alluded earlier to the challenges right now in the wine industry in general, alcohol industry in general. I'm curious, as the two of you look at Oregon specifically, what does the Oregon industry look like right now, and where is it going? What is the rest of the decade look like for Oregon wine?
I mean, I think it really depends to get a vibe or a perspective maybe, but just a general feeling who you talk to. But some people are very, very gloom and doom, and others it's I think the wine industry's refusal to shift how people are changing and why they're buying wine or how they're buying wine. So it's there's certainly wine brands out there that have been very successful and sold out their wines recently. And some of that may be the scale. They made scale less than their brand perception and what they could sell. But I think if nothing else right now, the brands, from what I've talked to people in general, that are situated in a little bit more of the direct to consumer, less in national distribution and wholesale. So that's kind of the 2,000 cases or less, are doing, I think, very well. Ones that have evolved with how they work with social media and advertising and telling a story, I think are doing a lot better than people that are just putting out labels on shelves that are pretty or aesthetic, and they eye-catching. People are shopping differently for wine than they used to. And I think Oregon is very well, situated because we are generally smaller brands. There's usually a better story. We're not producing grocery store brands that necessarily generally always get shipped everywhere. But even Union's been very successful with their size of telling a story and driving a certain marketing ethos, especially with their canned wine. So it doesn't have to necessarily be a big or small, but I think generally just because of the size and the intimate relationship of a lot of the tastings people will do in Oregon with usually it's the winemaker in the tasting room, because your brand is only so big. I think that's sort of being welcomed into a family and embrace. I think that has Oregon well poised compared to some of the competition. And not that there's not bad wine made in Oregon, but I think generally when you compare the bulk fruit that you see maybe coming from some other wine regions, Oregon generally sits on the higher price point, the quality standpoint, the sector of that the 20 plus dollar bottle to up to like, the $50 bottle. Like that section of the wine industry isn't hurting as bad as like, the less than $20 bigger bulk bottle. I mean, if nothing else in the Pacific Northwest, we can look to Chateau Ste. Michelle pulling out of like Washington, a lot of their purchases, like 40% 2 years ago. I mean, that's a marketing shift that they saw and adjusted. And also about the same time as when they purchased A to Z. I mean, those were all strategic movements of them watching how the wine industry changes for sure as like a company. So it kind of, again, I think supports a lot of where Oregon is. But again, we still have to keep telling that personal story, what makes us unique. And that can even be like amongst partners. Like obviously we buy fruit, so like we're as much, advertising, working with, Gemini and RPG on our labels as anything else. And like that's something they're interested in as well. Like we're again back to like probably the 70s era, not that it's ever really left Oregon, but like no one's like closed doors. There's always been a good interaction and like we grow together, I think, aspect of this industry that kind of got lost at some point, I think, in the story in like Napa, where it started to be more of a competition. I think Oregon's still maintained that, even though, the industry's, 50 years old now, I guess in a lot of ways. So I think we've kept true to our origins, and I think that will help us if we're telling each other stories as well. I mean, Oregon Pinot Camp's another good example of that, rising together.
I think as a company, we're still open to change, right? Like, we didn't start at the strong time when everyone just wants to pick up the wine and has all the flexible spending income to buy it. So, we're going to adapt. We're trying to, we come up with our brand voice and we'll try and we'll test it and we'll ease into the market. And I don't think we come in with grand expectations. So if you don't set, you set realistic goals, then hopefully that just continues to give us some momentum to grow into, who we'll end up being in a couple of years. Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay, cool, great.
Yeah.
We didn't fully align.
Yeah. Well, no, I think we're figuring it out step by step from every aspect. So it's like, what do we need to do today?
And that includes reading like the wine industry reports, right? To say, what does the industry look like? And are we doing the right things? And if we're not, we need to change. And we're not, too set in ways to do that. I
mean, from a brand perspective, maybe not a sales perspective, but like finding good grapes and making those partnerships, it's a great time because there is good fruit available. And when you build those relationships, they're not going to drop you just because someone else comes in and says they're interested, because you have years of working with them, paying your growers probably fair prices for fruit, even though like the market could have dictated differently. Mm-hmm. It's like, it's a good time in that aspect, but you're hedging the bet and playing the long game. So I think, entering in 22 would have been a very different like market on the other side, is like finding fruit and not like overpaying for it, or even it being available. So it's like, you gotta, just like buying and selling houses. You wanna buy your house cheap but sell it high. It's like those two markets don't exist at the same time.
All the questions that I have for the two of you today. Anything I didn't ask that I should have, or anything we didn't cover that you were hoping to cover today?
I don't think so.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Well, thank you both so much for taking the time to share your story with us. Congratulations on launching your brand. Congratulations on second child. Congratulations on everything.
Thank you.
It's been quite a 2025 for you too. Thanks for taking time to share your story with us, and we'll go ahead and let you off the hook.
Awesome. Thank you very much.